Hello, I'm Paul Carroll, technical writer for Digital Photo Magazine, and welcome to this Understanding RAW video tutorial on using the new localized RAW adjustment tools in Photoshop CS4. Until now, all the adjustments which were applied to a RAW image file had to be applied globally. That is, the alteration affected every pixel in the image. So if we wanted to lighten the exposure, for example, the adjustment would be global, affecting both the birds in the foreground and also the sky. With the new graduated filter and adjustment brush tools, however, it's now possible to make adjustments selectively to different areas of a RAW file. So for example, using the graduated filter, I can darken down the sky selectively without affecting the birds in the foreground too much. Then if I need to change the exposure in a very intricate part of the image, say on this bird's head on the right hand side for example, which is a little bit too dark, I can paint in an exposure adjustment using the new adjustment brush, just to lighten the bird's head. So this is a much more intuitive way of making a split RAW conversion than the previous method of making two conversions and then having to combine them later in Photoshop. These two new tools are only available in the Camera Raw plugin that is included with Photoshop CS4 or in the Develop module of Lightroom 2, making this the most recent and advanced method of boosting dynamic range during a RAW conversion. Okay, enough explanation. I'm going to close down my final image and then we can get started. Start by opening the digital negative or .dng file birds.dng from off the CD into Photoshop CS4. And the first thing that you'll notice is that we've got a highlights clipping warning in the sky, showing us where we've got burnt out pixels, but also the stone game birds in the foreground are badly underexposed. This is because at the time of capture, I made sure I didn't completely burn out the sky by slightly underexposing the shot. And this has ensured I've retained some colour detail in the sky. You can see the areas on the right hand side and the left hand side, although the very brightest areas of the sky have become burnt out, but we can bring those back during the RAW conversion process. Making sure you retain some detail in a bright sky is a great tip when you're shooting RAW and you're faced with these extremes of brightness. This is because during the conversion process it's easier to lighten and boost the colour in the darker end of the tonal register, where some detail will be lurking within the RAW file, as opposed to trying to bring back detail into burnt out pixels where there's no information at all. So just bear that in mind when you're out and about shooting your RAW images. Okay, let's get on with the RAW conversion. First thing I'm going to do is crop the image and just straighten up these stone game birds which are just falling over to the left. To do that I'm going to use the straighten tool. So go up to the toolbar here at the top of the screen and we want to select the straighten tool, which is roughly in the middle. We can now draw a line with our straighten tool by clicking with our mouse button and just dragging a line out under the birds. Now I want to straighten them up, so if I make sure that I've got a roughly equal amount of distance between the bird in the bottom left hand corner and the line in the right hand corner, and then release my mouse button, there you go, you can see that our crop has been rotated, and now just click in the center of the crop box and I can move the crop box to the left just to frame the birds back into the center of the frame. I think that's looking pretty good, so once I'm happy with my crop, just hit return on the keyboard to apply it. And there we go, the birds are looking much straighter now. Okay, next I'm going to move on to some global adjustments that I want to make to the RAW file before I start using the new localized adjustment tools. First thing I'm going to do is warm up the image. So I'm going to use the temperature slider and I'm just going to click with my mouse and drag the slider to the right just to warm up the image, and I'm going to go to a degrees Kelvin of around 5500. Next I'm going to boost the exposure globally across the whole image. So I'm going to do that using the exposure slider. So I'm just going to move this slider to the right to boost the exposure. I'm going to go to a exposure of around +2 stops, and you can see as I move the slider up, my highlights clipping warning is showing that the sky is now completely burnt out. But don't worry, because we're going to bring that back using a combination of the recovery slider and also the new graduated filter. So let's start with the recovery slider, And again, I'll just click and hold with my mouse, and then I can move the recovery. And I'm going to boost the recovery quite aggressively. I'm going to go to a setting of around plus 80. And you can see that that's really diminished the highlight clippings warning that we've got in the sky, which shows the sky isn't completely burnt out. Only these areas in red here are completely burnt out, but it's still looking pretty flat and boring. So we're just going to use the graduated filter tool to really boost the sky and give it a lot more impact. But we'll come on to that stage in a second. Finally, I just want to boost the colour saturation in the image. So I'm going to use the saturation slider, which is right down at the bottom of the basic palette. And I'm just going to increase the saturation to a setting of around plus 20. And there we go, with those two simple steps of just straightening and cropping and then boosting the exposure and the saturation, the image is already looking a lot better. Now we want to turn our attention to the localized adjustment tools, however. And first, we're going to really add some more punch and drama to the sky using the graduated filter tool. You can select the graduated filter up here in the toolbar, and you can see on the right hand side of the screen our basic tab has now changed, and we've got a new graduated filter tab. And these sliders here all represent the different types of adjustments we can make to our image using the graduated filter. So we've got exposure, brightness, contrast, saturation, clarity, sharpness and colour. So we're going to set up our adjustment values before we add the graduated filter. So using the adjustment slider, I'm going to knock back the exposure to -3. That'll really darken down the sky, and also I'm going to reduce the brightness. So I'm going to take the brightness to around -50. Now it's a good idea to set up your adjustment values before you add the filter, but once you've added the filter, you can come back and edit any of these settings and play around with the sliders, really fine tune the effect that you're after. Okay, so I'm now going to add the graduated filter. So by clicking with my left mouse button roughly about halfway down the sky and then starting to pull down, you can see that we've applied the graduated filter. And the adjustment settings that we've dialed in, i.e. -3 for the exposure and -50 for the brightness, that's now being affected at this part of the image above the green line. And the gradient is taking effect between the green line and the red line. So what we need to do is pull that red line down even further so that we get a nice smooth blend and a natural looking finish. So I'm just going to drag the red line down further, and you can see as I drag the red line down, I'm now starting to lose that highlight clipping warning, and I'm just going to keep pulling it down. I'm going to go all the way below the heads of the birds, just to the sort of tree line in the background. And then when I'm done, just release my mouse button. Another little handy tip when you're adding your gradient as well is I was holding down the shift key on the keyboard, and that meant that this line here remained straight and makes it much easier to make a top to bottom gradient. Now that we've added our graduated filter, we can change any of these adjustment sliders. So for example, as long as I've got edit mode ticked here, I can adjust the exposure slider, and you can see if I go into positive values, I'm now getting a highlight clippings warning back in the sky. So once you've added the filter, you can go back and really fine tune your adjustments. I'm going to leave my exposure set to -3. And if we wanted to add a new gradient, all we'd need to do is click on the new button, set up the gradient filter. So let's say I want to increase the exposure in the foreground, and I'm just going to boost the saturation and the clarity. And then again, all I need to do is click on the image, and I can add my second graduated filter. But if I'm not happy with my graduated filter, then all I need to do is hit the delete key and it's removed. Okay, time to move on to the adjustment brush. Now the adjustment brush is a great tool for painting adjustments very selectively to intricate parts of an image. And in this example, we're just going to use it to lighten down the game bird's head on the right hand side. As a result of pulling down our graduated filter below the head of the game birds, you can see that this head here on the right hand side is just looking a little bit darker than the rest of the bird's body. So I'm just going to use the adjustment brush to paint half a stop of exposure over this bird's head. So I'm going to select the adjustment brush from the toolbar, and you can see the panel on the right hand side has now changed, and we've got our adjustment brush settings. So we've got the same sliders so that we can adjust exposure, brightness, contrast, saturation, clarity, sharpness and colour, but then beneath that we've also got a number of other options which will allow us to configure the size, feathering, flow and density of our adjustment brush. We've also got an auto mask option, which helps you mask very quickly around intricate areas like hair in a portrait, for example, as long as there's a lot of contrast. And we've got a show mask option, which shows us exactly where we're painting with the adjustment brush on the image preview. And we've also got a show pins option, and I'll come on to that in a few minutes. So first I'm going to zoom in tight on the image because it's quite intricate work, so I need to work quite carefully. So I'm going to select the zoom tool and I'm just going to zoom in very tightly on the area that I want to paint. Select the adjustment brush again, and now I'm going to configure my brush size. So I want a fairly small brush, so around a 10 pixel radius will be fine. I want it very feathered, so we get a nice graduated blend. So I'm going to go for the maximum feathering, which is 100, and I'm just going to reduce the flow to around 70. I don't want to tick auto mask because we've got a nice sharp edge to the bird's head, which is going to be pretty easy to paint along, but I am going to just tick the show mask option and just show you exactly what that does. Now, just before I start painting, I just need to set up my adjustments. So I'm just going to increase the exposure to around half a stop, and that's just going to lighten this section of the bird's head ever so slightly. Okay, so with everything set up, I can now just click with my left mouse button on the image and I can start painting. Now you can see that grey mask which is appearing on the image. That appears because I've got the show mask icon ticked. So I'm just going to work around fairly quickly. I want to make sure that I don't go over the edge of the bird's head, because then we're going to get a slight haloing, which is going to look unsightly. So there we go, that's looking pretty good. Now the show pins icon, which I referred to earlier, in the bottom left hand corner of the adjustment brush palette, with that ticked, it's now showing us a pin on our image preview, and that pin refers to the area that we've just adjusted. And so if I untick the show pins, you can see that our pin has just disappeared. And if you're planning on making a lot of adjustments with the adjustment brush or the graduated filter, it's a good idea to have show pins ticked, and then you can switch between your different adjustments if you need to edit them. Okay, so with the show mask box ticked, we can now see exactly where we've painted, but we can't really see what effect it's had on the image. So as you're working around with the adjustment brush, it's a good idea just to untick the show mask box and you can evaluate your adjustment. So I'm just going to untick the preview box, and you can just see there that I've lightened the bird's head ever so slightly. It's not a dramatic alteration, but it's enough just to keep the top of the bird's head more in line with the exposure on his body. And if I wanted to increase the exposure ever so slightly, I can just do that using the exposure slider. Just say if I go to say 0.7, again use the preview box at the top of the screen here just to evaluate the adjustment, and I think that's looking pretty good now. So there's just one more feature of the adjustment brush left to show you, and that's the erase function. Now if I just tick the show mask box at the bottom of the palette, it's going to be easier to demonstrate the erase function. As the name suggests, it's to erase away any mistakes that you've made with the adjustment brush. And you can see here on the left hand side of the bird's head, I've just spilt onto the head of the bird behind him. So if I just click on the erase box, you can see that the sliders under my brush configuration at the bottom have slightly changed. I no longer have the ability to set the density of the eraser tool, it has to be 100%. I can set the size of my eraser tool brush, so I'm going to leave that at 10. My feathering has been set back to 0, and I'm going to leave it at 0 because what I want to do now is get a very sharp edge to the bird's head. So I'm just going to erase away this area of mask and exposure adjustment using the eraser tool. So again, just clicking with my mouse, I just paint onto the image, and because I'm working with a very sharp edged brush, I need to work just a little bit more carefully than I did before, and I want to go right up to the edge of the bird's head just to give me a nice sharp defined edge to that adjustment. So there we go, I'm just erasing away the adjustment that I painted on earlier. That's looking pretty good. I can untick the show mask box again and then use the preview in the top of the screen, and you can see there that that's worked quite well, and my increase in exposure is now only taking effect on this bird's head. So there we go. If I zoom back out to the fit in view screen, you can see that I've made a split raw conversion all within Camera Raw by using the graduated filter to really add a lot more drama to our burnt out sky, and then just adjusting the exposure ever so slightly in a very small and intricate area of our image file using the adjustment brush. And this is a much smarter and more intuitive way of developing a raw file than having to make separate raw conversions which have to be combined in Photoshop. I hope you've really enjoyed this video tutorial. If you've got Photoshop CS4 or Lightroom 2, give the technique a go using the start image of the CD. And if not, and you're considering working a lot with raw files, then it's definitely time to consider an upgrade. Okay, cheers.